Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Airbnb files for its IPO. And huge news from Moderna on the vaccine front. The co-founder and chair will be my guest later this hour. But first, let's get to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle with a check of the markets and how they moved on this vaccine news. Abigail?
It was a risk-on session, of course, having to do with the vaccine released or the news out of Moderna that they have a vaccine that is 94.5% effective on a population of volunteers of greater than 30,000 people. So some real optimism there. And on that news, we have the S&P 500 finishing higher. We also had some nice gains out of the NASDAQ and Moderna itself sharply higher. Now, after the market, we did have 13F news coming, of course, from Berkshire, among many other big institutional investment holders. And the big news out of Berkshire, it's so interesting. They really added to their portfolio in the space of healthcare, including AbbVie, Merck, Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb. Typically, healthcare is a defensive space, but of course, with the virus, perhaps these additions have something to do with the virus. And Pfizer had been down sharply on the day after Moderna news around the virus came out. So a divergence there. But after hours, investors clearly liking Pfizer as well, Emily. So an interesting day, an interesting movement after hours having to do with those institutions and what they did in the third quarter, Emily.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for that roundup. I want to get to Airbnb's filing. The company now disclosing details of its initial public offering plans for the very first time, releasing financial results and previously confidential information on its operations. This listing set to be one of the biggest of the year, capping an IPO surge that has largely defied the economic devastation inflicted by the pandemic. For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg's Crystal Z, who's been pouring through the S1 that just crossed. Crystal, pull out some of the highlights for us that you are seeing so far.
Yeah, so as expected, we are seeing a bit of a third quarter rebound. But then more notably, the revenue took a hit from the pandemic. For the 9 months ended in September, it's down 32% year over year. That's the top line of Airbnb. And net loss, however, has narrowed in the same period. It's a $374 million decrease in net loss. But it's a 350 pages filing. We're still going through it. It hits about 20 minutes ago, so there'll be more to come.
Let's talk about some of the risk factors. Airbnb saying we might not be able to achieve profitability. That is not unusual to read in the S1 filing of a tech company. Also says its revenue growth rate will continue to slow in the future. They're going to see greater decline in nights and experiences year over year, and that COVID will continue to adversely affect the business. You know, obviously, Airbnb has bounced back somewhat in the pandemic, but it still continues to be a big risk factor. And even though we are getting hopeful news about a vaccine is not here. What do investors need to consider as they consider making a bet on this company?
Yeah, that is right. So as you mentioned, it's not uncommon for companies to have a very, very long risk factor. And for Airbnb, they really have to hedge this. Actually, the first and foremost, the biggest bullet point in the risk factor that they mentioned is the COVID pandemic and its impact to the business, the operation, and their financial conditions. And, just because, this pandemic really limits social gathering, and that makes it very difficult for Airbnb to continue their business. But then, this is really up to the investors to take a bet, but they have disclosed that in their prospectus and warned that these declines in profits or these losses could continue in the foreseeable future, and they may not even be able to achieve profitability altogether. But that's, again, it's like a very typical language you see in S1.
Now, I had a long and wide-ranging sit-down with Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky earlier in the pandemic, and he was quite frank about how terrifying it was and the Titanic hit their business took, but also talked about where he was seeing the company bounce back and how the company has really gone back to its roots. We're seeing here in the filing, they now have almost 7.5 million listings available as of the end of September. They've pulled back on some of the other more experimental businesses and gone back to home and apartment sharing, and that is going to be, he says, their bread and butter for the foreseeable future. Is that going to be enough from a growth perspective for investors who are wondering about the company's future prospects?
Yeah, that's not the only thing that they did. They also had a pretty big job cut during the pandemic. So we saw that cost is actually lower because of that, and something like a quarter of the company was let go, and the very famous tearful announcement from Chesky to the employee, which we also reported. That is, like you said, it's up to investors to decide whether they have done enough in cutting costs and going back to growth mode. Right now, they have shown that the revenue, actually the top line has gone up. So it seems that what Brian said in that interview that he did with you, he has delivered.
So what are next steps? When are we expecting this to actually happen? I know we were looking at potentially December and certainly before the end of the year. Are they on track for that?
Yeah, so given that they filed today, 15 days from now, they are allowed to market to investors. So as early as 15 days from now, we will see a price range, which will give us a good sense of what Airbnb is valued at. And by then, followed by a several-day-long roadshow, they will determine on a price and will list on NASDAQ following that. So we will be following this whole process, but right now we're just like combing through their prospectus and see what else is interesting.
They'll be listing under the ticker ABNB on the NASDAQ. Crystal, there had been some talk or speculation that Airbnb was considering the long-term stock exchange, which is sort of an alternative exchange. This would have been certainly a departure from the traditional path and a huge win for the long-term stock exchange. What do you make of the fact that they have chosen a more tried and true path here?
So that is really more of a, I would say that it's probably more of a marketing, that they have made this pledge to comply to these ESG standards more so than improving the trading liquidity. Right now, there's nothing trades on the long-term stock exchange, and Airbnb isn't rushing to this decision either. Anything that they do wouldn't happen until as early as next year. So it's a big win for a long-term stock exchange, which only started operating in September. So nobody knows what it will be like because nobody is listed on it, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Okay, well, we will be watching, and we're going to continue. I know you will be continuing to pour through Airbnb's S1 that just crossed. Bloomberg Crystal Z, who covers IPOs for us, thank you so much for your analysis there. Coming up, could the end of the pandemic be in sight? Moderna is out with new data showing its vaccine is 94.5% effective. We're going to hear from the co-founder and chair, Noubar Afeyan, about how their vaccine has an advantage over Pfizer. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Moderna said Monday its COVID vaccine is 94.5% effective in a preliminary analysis of a large late-stage clinical trial. The highly positive readout comes just a week after a similar shot developed by Pfizer and BioNTech was found to have an efficacy of more than 90%. I sat down with the co-founder and chair, Noubar Afeyan, earlier today and got his thoughts on the new data and the distribution timeline.
We think that this is highly encouraging as it relates to the possibility that our vaccine, and hopefully those of others, will have a profound impact on pushing back the damage that's being done by this virus. And the reason is because we need to attack this at the level of hundreds of millions of people, if not billions. This is not a treatment. This is, if you think about it this way, it's a preemptive treatment. In other words, your own immune system is going to defend you against the virus. And what we've shown is in a trial of 30,000 subjects, where we've already received some 95 cases of infection. In those, 90 of them were in a population that did not receive the vaccine, and only 5 were infections in the population that did. That's what the 94.5% protection comes from. And as that scales to millions and hundreds of millions of people, we should be able to save lives, avoid severe disease, we hope, and push back this pandemic.
So what are next steps, and when can you file for an emergency use authorization?
We're in close collaboration with the regulatory and other authorities, both for the authorization and the distribution of the vaccine. In terms of authorization, we will pursue an emergency use authorization, for which we still need to finalize gathering some safety data that will happen over the next days, and then prepare the file for review by the FDA, including the advisory committee, VRBPAC. That should happen in early December, we hope, if all goes as planned. And once we get the authorization, we're already ready with supplies and with the distribution to be able to start reaching out to the frontline workers and the population that the CDC deems appropriate to apply the first wave of vaccine to.
So when would that first wave be? When can people actually start getting the vaccine?
The vaccine will be distributed through the Operation Warp Speed supply chain that has been set up, and it will be available at first at the level of tens of millions of doses. I would suspect before the end of this year, some 20 to 40 million doses will be made available. We've already said 20 million of it will come from us. Then in going into the first quarter, that number should ramp up to as much as 50 to 100 million doses just from us. And that will ramp up through the year 2021 to 500 to 1 billion doses, at which capacity we are planning to operate. We won't be the only vaccine. There'll be other vaccines too. So as it relates to individuals receiving it, I would say the first wave will be the most vulnerable. The second wave will begin to be a bit broader. And I think in the second quarter of 2021, we should begin to see broader uptake. Now, we of course don't know to what extent people will hesitate in taking the vaccine. We hope this kind of data, both on the efficacy and safety end, together with proper communication and leadership at many levels from the medical community as well as the government, will lead people to take it up as much as possible. And so that will also dictate timing.
Now, there was a lot of excitement around the Pfizer news, which uses the same mRNA technology that Moderna uses, but then we learned it needs to be stored at negative 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Yours can be stored at refrigerator temperature for 30 days, as I understand it. What kind of advantage does that give you?
Well, I should say, Emily, that, Moderna pioneered this messenger RNA field and has worked in it for 10 years and has worked on nothing else. There are many people who have entered the field more recently who are using technologies that we used and looked at some years ago. And we've spent quite a bit of effort trying to actually achieve the minus 20 degrees centigrade target, the minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which is our long-term storage conditions, already something that can be done quite broadly because that capability exists. And then, of course, what you just mentioned, which is we announced today the results, just-in results on our storage conditions, where it's clear that not only can we keep things at minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, but we can also keep things under refrigeration for up to 30 days. And in fact, even more so, for 12 hours, we can have it at room temperature sitting on a table. And what that means is that we want to take the pressure off of the distribution system, both to try to do unusual things, avoid it, but also not to feel the stress of getting things wrong. Because every one of these vaccines is going to be precious, because there will be a limited supply for a prolonged period of time. So we don't want 10 vials to go bad or 100 vials because people didn't approach it properly. So that, I'd say that this is not a recent innovation for us. Moderna has some 10 other vaccines that it's put into the clinic over the last few years. And the COVID-19 one is the beneficiary of all of that experience and innovation applied to something at a scale we never imagined we'd have to work in.
That said, your vaccine also needs 2 doses, just like the Pfizer vaccine. And, getting people to come back is going to be a challenge. Talk to us about your distribution plan, how much you think you can manufacture, and how challenging you think the process of just getting this out into the world will be.
Look, I think that there's a lot that's been done to prepare for this moment. I can say, for example, in the US, the work of Operation Warp Speed has been not just at the securing the supplies that we needed, the supplies that we will provide to the vaccine distribution program, but the entire distribution chain and the preparedness for that. So while there's a lot of work to do, I think we've already done quite a bit. And look, the idea about 2 doses, it's an interesting thing because just about everything related to vaccines these days has become a point of debate and speculation. But the reason we are using 2 doses is to give people the maximum amount of protection. When we set out to do this, we could well have done it with 1 dose. It's my own personal opinion based on data we have from animal work and others. But we chose 2 and we chose 100 microgram because we could. Why? Because we wanted the highest possible protection, because we anticipated the burden of disease would be so high, so terrible, that we just needed to flat out protect people.
More of my conversation with Noubar Afeyan, the chair and co-founder of Moderna, after this quick break. Before we go, I do want to tell you that Tesla has just been added to the S&P 500, a huge milestone for Tesla. This coming after some record delivery numbers and profitability. Shares jumping 5% after hours. We'll keep our eyes on that as we head to break. Tesla joining the S&P 500 officially. Moderna was a little-known company just a year ago and is now emerging with a potentially leading vaccine candidate for COVID-19. More of my conversation now with co-founder and chair Noubar Afeyan about the unique technology behind it.
Moderna is a product of a whole new different way of thinking about innovation that we employ at Flagship Pioneering, which is the firm that I established some 20 years ago with colleagues. And the idea there is to, rather than look at the way science advances incrementally, instead think about leaping to not yet discovered, not yet invented capabilities, and first figure out what would you wish you could do if you could do anything. And among the hundreds of such explorations we carry out every year, every 2 years, what we uncovered here was that if only you could provide to a human a code that will cause their own cells to make a protein that's either therapeutic or preventative, well, then that capability would be a significant advance over the state-of-the-art of biotechnology. And this was back in 2010. We didn't know how to do it. We didn't know how effective it would be, whether it would be safe. But we first envisioned that such an arbitrary, imaginary thing could be possible. And then we started working backwards. If you were going to do this, what would it take? Can we prove it? How robust is it, et cetera? That innovation process that we practiced, Flagship, this was actually the entity was called LS18. We number our projects. It was the 18th such life science project we had done. And it eventually became Moderna because we went into labs. We actually tried a number of approaches. Again, we were not looking for an application for a discovery. We were looking to make a discovery to fit an application that we got convinced would be transformative. And the first years were actually quite remarkable.
What was the eureka moment where you realized that mRNA, which is completely unique and new to the vaccine world and basically tricks the body into producing what it needs to fight without actually injecting the virus, what was the eureka moment that was going to work?
The idea of messenger RNA is that you take a code, you formulate it in a particular drug-like way, you enter the body with it, and it gets into the cells you want, and it starts making a protein. Theoretically, any protein, because every one of your cells can take any code and make any protein. By the way, parenthetically, this virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is an mRNA-based virus. It's an RNA-based virus. It does the same thing. In fact, viruses have figured out how to do what it took the biotech industry 40 years to figure out how to do, which is to stick RNA in the body and then give the cells that they infect the code by which they can reconstitute themselves. So, I mean, the irony is not lost on us that the very thing that is going to undo, we hope, or do in the virus is going to be an innovation the virus had made to begin with.
Now, there are some questions about the underlying IP and reporting that the NIH might own some of the patents that Moderna is using. Is that correct? What's the deal there?
The NIH has very productively for us been both a collaborator of ours and has worked on the underlying protein that is a vulnerability of this class of virus, which is called the S protein. And that protein they had worked on for many years for MERS vaccine, et cetera. Several years ago, we began to collaborate with them to actually develop a MERS vaccine, which was just about ready to get into phase 1 human trials when the SARS-CoV-2 hit earlier this year. And in fact, that same team and Moderna immediately decided to collaborate to change the protein sequence to the one from this virus and not its cousin virus, and that benefited us. Now, from an intellectual property standpoint, the NIH and others have filed proteins that are kind of broad background proteins on the spike protein, which, by the way, everybody is using the spike protein, so that'll be an important thing. Beyond that, the mRNA vaccine that we make takes advantage of many inventions that we've made, including for this, excuse me, COVID-19 vaccine. And that is intellectual property that Moderna has.
Stock sales of the executives of some of the biggest pharma companies that are working on vaccines have been scrutinized. And I know that your fund, which is a huge shareholder in Moderna, sold some stock earlier this year. What is your response?
There are things people have said about individual decisions. Of course, in our case, Flagship was the founding institution and owned all of the company in the very beginning. And in fact, as we formulated the initial founding group with certain academic co-founders, we distributed some shares to them, and that's how the company got started. So actually, it's not Flagship's ownership is a founding ownership. It's not a investment ownership per se. Having said that, our investors basically invest in closed-end funds and at appropriate intervals, at appropriate open market situations, we've made small amounts of sales. In this case, it was a small fraction of our sales, which we effectuated. That's a very different thing than what people have been describing are these programmed 10b5 executive sales.
We could have talked for hours there. Noubar Afeyan, co-founder and chair of Moderna, on fascinating vaccine developments. Coming up, another historic launch for Elon Musk's SpaceX. A real-life astronaut will be joining us to talk about it all next. SpaceX hitting a huge milestone this past weekend. The Elon Musk company launching its first regular NASA mission to the International Space Station. 4 astronauts who took off from Cape Canaveral late Sunday will dock at the ISS around 11 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. Joining us now for more, Thomas Jones, a former NASA astronaut and 4-time space shuttle pilot. Tom, my kids and I were watching last night. They were so excited, and it's almost as if NASA is inspiring a new generation after all these years. What makes this particular launch so significant?
It's an exciting time for the country, Emily, because we're now going operational with these commercial crew transport services to the space station. So after the shuttle retired in 2011, we had no way to get to the space station, which we largely built, except for renting rockets from the Russians. And so now we're out from under the Russian monopoly with this operational launch of the SpaceX Crew Dragon. And next year, Boeing will join that fleet with their Starliner spacecraft. So NASA will have 2 reliable ways, really state-of-the-art ways to get to the space station for the next 10 years of its research life.
Now, what exactly are these astronauts going to be doing in space? We always hear the sort of vague, they're going to be helping out with scientific experiments, but give us some more details. What are they doing up there?
Right. So this crew of 4, the astronauts who just launched last night, that's Ike Glover and Mike Hopkins and Shannon Walker and Suichi Noguchi, they joined the crew of 3 that's already up there, 2 Sergeys from Russia and Kate Rubins, who's a scientist in her own right. And so that crew now has 1 extra person over the usual number of 6 to turn to science research on board the space station. More productivity, more person hours applied to science research in the 3 big labs up on the space station. So everything from growing plants on the station to help us forge a way to Mars by recycling carbon dioxide and making food in space, to astrophysics experiments with the alpha magnetic spectrometer. Latest experiment that I've really been intrigued by is using microbes to attack and process rocks from the moon or asteroids to make valuable economic materials. Side byproducts of the bacteria metabolism can produce economically valuable minerals and compounds that we might even use back on Earth, more likely use them in space, for the life support system or to construct building materials, for example, out of these micro-processed rocks from space.
So, as you mentioned, the names of the astronauts, including Shannon Walker, a female astronaut, an African-American astronaut. This is definitely a history-making mission, and I saw a lot of parents tweeting about their little girls watching this last night. Talk to us about how this partnership with SpaceX and how outside partnerships in general sort of change the equation for American efforts to get to the final frontier.
I think it's a big, important development that we've shifted over to involve and to enlist commercial partners in NASA's exploration program. So it's not just a taxi ride to the space station, but by bringing to the table new rocket designs, a way to recycle the first stage of the Falcon 9 SpaceX booster by landing it back on a recovery barge, for example. That's a new innovation. NASA used to recycle my old shuttle boosters, but not in such a sophisticated way. And so this lowering the cost of launch services to orbit is not only going to help NASA, funded by the taxpayer, but it's also going to free up funds in the NASA budget to go out to the moon and the asteroids and Mars. And, companies like SpaceX and Boeing are now going to be able to offer these same spacecraft to tourists who want to pay to go to orbit for a week, visit first the space station, but later on there are going to be commercial hotels and pharmaceutical and industrial labs in orbit that these transports will be able to service. So it's really bringing innovation into the NASA program and as well as lowering costs.
How far out is that, when a space tourist can go into space and stay at a hotel up there?
It's an exciting development. The more people, and I see in the next 10 years, hundreds of people going into space outside the professional astronaut ranks, I see that as generating a larger, broader base of support for NASA's exploration efforts. There are always going to be professional explorers employed by NASA and its international partners. But if you can have a private experience in space, first the wealthy, but then competition is going to bring that cost down. And in a generation, I think it'll be much like a trip to Antarctica is today, where you can take an adventure sojourn for a couple of weeks in orbit. And that's really important to engage a broader base of the public in the personal experience of space exploration.
I'm curious about the geopolitical forces at play here. Are we competing against China and Russia the same way we were in Cold War times when we landed on the moon, especially as we have a changeover in the U.S. administration?
I would say that we're not under the gun like we were during the Cold War days of the 1960s, where John F. Kennedy had committed the U.S. to trying to get a human on the moon first. The Soviets were certainly in that race in a very serious way. And we had tragic failures like a fire on the launch pad that killed 3 astronauts. That's how serious that competition was. The schedule was really pushing the United States to take on the maximum amount of risk. Now, today, we have geopolitical competition with the Chinese, who are most capable. The Russians are still involved, perhaps in a partnership with the Chinese in the next 10 years. But it's not a schedule-driven race like we think of in the 1960s space race. Instead, it's important to invest for the long term so that the U.S. has a technological advantage that it maintains over competitors like China. So the Chinese, for example, in 10 years, they want to have their people on the moon. Now, we did that over 50 years ago, but we can't allow the situation to develop where the Chinese are the only ones who can reach the moon's surface. You're no longer the technological leader of this planet if you can't work with your people on another planet.
Now, you have gone to space 4 times yourself. You've done multiple spacewalks. You helped install a critical part of the International Space Station, spent 53 days living and working in space. And I know that you personally have done a lot of research on asteroids. There's talk of mining, the objects, the debris in outer space. Talk to us about how feasible a project like that is and what the actual use of it would be.
So here's another example of commercial innovation in outer space exploration. We're bringing these commercial companies to space with these low-cost transports and reliable transports like the Crew Dragon and the Starliner, and that is going to also enable cheaper robotic missions to the moon's poles, where we know that there is water ice available. Also on the nearby asteroids, where there is water locked up in the minerals on the surface of some of these objects. And so water is like gold in space. You can make it into oxygen to breathe. You can drink the water, of course, and you can split that water into oxygen and hydrogen, which makes cheap rocket fuel available in space where it's needed, not having to be hauled up expensively from Earth. So I think the mining revolution is first going to start with water, perhaps purchased by the government as a reliable supply of rocket fuel. But then products from that mining operation will begin to trickle into the larger economy, using it for construction materials, for feeding a greenhouse, for example, for providing organic chemicals to be used for industrial processes in space. So it's great to start with government customers mining or buying water that's mined on the moon and the asteroids, but then soon that's going to lead to a commercial market for all these raw materials.
So fascinating. Tom Jones, former NASA astronaut, 4-time space shuttle pilot. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. This is one I'm going to share with my kids tonight. All right. It is the final day for big institutions to file 13F forms for the third quarter. Those lists of investor holdings that give us signals on where they're doubling down and pulling back. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Catherine Greifeld, who's been following all of this. Catherine, what are some highlights that you're pulling out?
Well, one of the big stories was Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. It went big on the drug makers. It added stakes in AbbVie, Merck, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and Pfizer, which we know delivered extremely good vaccine trial results last week. And its biggest position increase among those names was AbbVie. And you are seeing AbbVie climb in after-hours tradings now. It's up about 1.5% thanks to that Buffett boost. Meanwhile, you're seeing Pfizer rise as well, even though this is a name that traded on the back foot all day after Moderna came out with its own extremely good vaccine study today. But it's doing better in the post-market as some of these results filter in.
What are you seeing when it comes to tech in terms of, where firms are holding on and where they might be pulling back? As we know, the market caps of some of the biggest tech companies have really run up over the last year.
That's for sure, and it's definitely a mixed picture overall when you look at tech. You are seeing some big additions. Maverick, for example, it boosted its overall tech exposure by about 9%, and Microsoft was particularly popular. It was the top new buy at Third Point, and you saw others add to their positions there as well. But you are seeing appetite cool a bit for Amazon, for example. You saw D1 completely exit its stake, whereas Sorbonne and Third Point, they trimmed their holdings there. So kind of a mixed read. And again, I'll just note that this period covers through September 30th. So it's probably too early to read into whether these funds are exiting the stay-at-home trade now that we have these vaccine breakthroughs, but we know that some of them were definitely set up well headed into this most recent rotation away from tech that we're seeing at the moment.
So what about some of the new names on the block, like Snowflake, like Nikola, some of these high flyers or more sort of controversial ones that we've been watching, but a lot of investors are really excited about?
Yeah, these are the fun stories. Snowflake, for example, it's that cloud computing company that IPO'd in September, and it has just been on fire since then. It surged over 100%, and we now know that Coatue, Tiger Global, Viking, they were among the hedge funds that got in on some of that IPO action. But let's also look at NIO. It's a Chinese electric vehicle maker that has also just been red hot. Over the past 6 months, it's up over 1,200%, just surging. And we know that Bridgewater added a stake there. But on the less successful side, you have Vanguard adding a new 3.4 position in Nikola, another EV, and that's been more of a boom and bust story. It surged over nearly 700%, I should say, through early June, but it's fallen 72% since then, so maybe not the best timing for Vanguard.
That's what I meant when I said controversial. Okay, Bloomberg's Catherine Greifeld, thanks for digging through all that for us. Really interesting to see where strategy is heading. All right, coming up, we're going to hear from former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger about COVID-19 and its impact on U.S.-China relations. Some pretty dramatic revelations at our Bloomberg New Economy Forum. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Henry Kissinger was the architect of U.S.-China relations in the modern era. The former Secretary of State spoke earlier today at Bloomberg's New Economy Forum on what COVID means for international relations and whether there is a global solution.
There are differences on the issue of human rights. And it is important for each side to understand the sensitivities of the other and not necessarily to solve the problem, but to alleviate it to a point where further progress is possible. One of the basic historic issues is that Americans deal with foreign policy as a largely pragmatic issue of a series of specific problems. Chinese deal with foreign policy primarily as a view of historical evolution. So when the American and the Chinese president meet, they're not necessarily talking about the same subject. And we have to begin to understand the historical issues, and the Chinese have to understand that it is important not only to arrive at a destination, but to have some points in between that need to be dealt with.
Do you think that there is a way in which people can learn from history? And do you think the Chinese really understand the context of global in the same way as America is used to?
The history of China is different from the history of America. And Americans have had a history of relatively uninterrupted success. The Chinese have had a very long history of repeating crises. America has had the good fortune of being free of immediate dangers. Chinese have usually been surrounded by countries that have had designs on their unity. It's necessary that each side learns enough about the basic views of the other and above all of the basic principles and definition of the national interest of the other to begin a dialogue. What we can learn from history is that great catastrophes can occur if societies slip into a conflict on the basis of having repeated these conflicts for a long time until suddenly it blows up, which is how World War I started. The issue itself was no different from 10 others that had been dealt with in previous decades. But this time, the method of diplomacy that had been used then didn't work. We need an effort designed to avoid the worst. Of course, each side will defend its national interests, and this will be understood. And we should not turn this into where can we conciliate China. The issue is, can we achieve outcomes which both sides can coexist.
Fascinating conversation there. You can catch more of that at Bloomberg.com. Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Reminder, the New Economy Forum will continue tomorrow with a stellar lineup of guests, including Bridgewater's Ray Dalio, ECB head Christine Lagarde. You can catch the event across all Bloomberg platforms. I'll be interviewing the president of Didi, Jean Liu, and Neil Shen of Sequoia. Coming up, Bitcoin on another bull run with some crypto investors betting on a $20,000 price tag by year end. An outlook from Bitcoin bull Raoul Pal, co-founder and CEO of Real Vision Group, is next. This is Bloomberg. Bitcoin is in the midst of another notable rally. The cryptocurrency is on a 6-week running streak and at highs not seen since 2017. But the mania that surrounded digital currencies back then is largely absent this time around. We're joined by Raoul Pal, founder and CEO of Real Vision Group and global macro investor who's been extremely bullish on the coin and thinks we should be just as excited about it now as we were back in 2017. So, Raoul, what's driving these gains?
The gains are being driven by the impact of all of the global central banks printing a lot of money right now, also the excessive fiscal stimulus. So there's a lot more money around, and Bitcoin is probably the hardest of all assets. It has a very restricted supply, even more so than gold has. And investors have finally tuned into the fact that this is a way of protecting the value of their money. So it's been driven by that narrative as becoming a kind of store of value for people. And it's gone from being a retail adoption, which was 2017, and now becoming an institutionally adopted asset class. And that shift is enormous.
Now, you are taking on what you call an irresponsible amount of risk and going long Bitcoin. Why?
Simply, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've been in the macro world. I've started and ran the hedge fund sales business in equity and equity derivatives at Goldman. I ran a global macro hedge fund. I advised many of the world's biggest hedge funds for global macro investor itself. This is the biggest single opportunity I've ever seen. Because what we're doing, this Bitcoin itself is the best performing asset class of all time, of the last 5 years, of the last 2 years. And this year, it's already up 135%. It's still in price discovery mode. And while the institutional wall of money starts coming into the space, I think it goes up maybe another 25 or 50x from here. You just don't find those kind of returns in any other asset anywhere in the world. So it's truly an extraordinary opportunity.
But what could go wrong for Bitcoin investors? I mean, talk about the primary risks: power outage, regulatory risks. What if governments just don't accept it?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, I've spent a lot of time reading the papers of the BIS, the IMF, the ECB, the Bank of England, the Fed, and they're all talking about digital currencies, as we know. They're talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. They understand it's part of the landscape. So yes, they're going to regulate it, but in the way of regulating exchanges and making it integrate within the current financial system and that future, central bank digital currency system that they're building. So there is no noise whatsoever that they're not happy or comfortable with it. So I don't think it's going to be banned. And even if it does, it's on the internet, it's everywhere, it's pervasive. Even when the US banned gold back in 1933, it traded everywhere else in the world. So I don't think that that's a thing. Now, in terms of the electricity outage story, well, if the global electricity supply is gone, we've got other things to worry about, and you probably won't be able to get your gold out of the gold vault. You'll be looking for food and guns at that point. So I think we need to be careful. The other one that comes up is quantum computing, which I think everybody's aware of, and people are building protocols around that, around Bitcoin as well.
All right, fascinating stuff. We will be checking on your predictions. Raoul Pal, co-founder and CEO of Real Vision Group, thank you so much for weighing in. Finally, tomorrow we will be watching Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter's Jack Dorsey. They're going to be back in the congressional hot seat. Both CEOs will be testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. This will be their second appearance in less than a month. Republicans are likely to focus on how they handled the New York Post reporting on President-elect Biden's son, Hunter Biden. Democrats will be wanting more moderation, though not less. The hearing is called Breaking the News: Censorship Suppression and the 2020 Election. We will have reaction to that when we catch up with Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Bloomberg Daybreak Asia coming up next. This is Bloomberg.